First of all, welcome everybody. My name is Mike Frank. I'm the director here at the Hoover Institution's Washington, D.C. office, and you're welcome to come. I'm going to be quick, in and out in about 90 seconds, but I want to say one thing. Last week we had one of our senior fellows here who's been a senior fellow, a professor at Harvard for about 50 years, Harvey Mansfield. And we had a little round table with him. He did some other events. And a lot of the folks who came to that, it was sort of a general big picture discussion, were his former students. And they had gone on in their own way, inspired by Harvey Mansfield, to very productive and great careers in academia and think tanks and so on. And it was really wonderful to see him interrelate with students he had 20, 30, 35 years ago. And how much you can see how much of an impact he made on them. And tonight's very much the same way. The Fouad Ajami Memorial Lectures is really the product of his students at Hopkins. And it's magnificent to see how his legacy can live on through events like this and the quality of speakers we've had. This is the third one. And Steve Hadley, who you'll hear from tonight, follows H.O. McMaster, General McMaster, and General Petraeus, who were the first two speakers of this. So that's a wonderful legacy. It's evident here tonight. And I'm saying this in part because we have a lot of students here from St. Albans. And someday you're going to be graduating from college, going on to grad school, and some professors are going to really shape and influence your lives. So this is the kind of stuff that happens after all that's said and done. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jackie, who's going to do the proper introduction. But welcome here at Hoover. Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Mike. On behalf of the board of the Fouad Ajami Fellowship, we'd like to welcome you this evening to our third annual lecture series. Just to give you some background, the fellowship was established after Dr. Ajami passed away by a group of his former students and colleagues who came together to celebrate his work and his life's work through an endowment at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Through it, we are now sponsoring different graduate level research and study programs in the Middle East, as well as hosting a lecture series to further the policy discussion and debate of the United States and its role abroad. Tonight's event, first of all, can only happen with the help of generosity of others who are committed people and organizations who are supporting Dr. Ajami's legacy. So the board would like to thank, first of all, Henry and Marie Jose Kravitz, as well as Stanford's Hoover Institute for their generous support and ongoing collaboration on this lecture series. We would also like to thank Mike Frank, your team, Aaron Nichols and Ms. Megan Ring, both of whom are not here this evening, but for all their hard work in organizing this event and their commitment to the initiative overall. Additionally, we'd like to extend our deep gratitude to Michelle, who is here today with us, is keeping Dr. Ajami's legacy alive with the work you're doing in the region, especially in particular with Syrian refugees. Many of us here tonight and across the wider DC policy world have gained tremendously from Dr. Ajami's great intellect and humility. Despite the disarray and ongoing crisis in the region, it was his provocative instinct and lyrical voice of realism and nuanced insight that helped translate not just the history, but the aspirations and anguish of the Arab world. Dr. Ajami's intellectual courage led us all to be wiser about the Arab world. And that keen judgment won him many friends and strong relationships. And we're here tonight to not only honor him, but those relationships. One of those relationships is with tonight's speaker, former National Security Advisor and respected principal of Rice Hadley Gates, Mr. Stephen Hadley. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to speak with one of our board members, Adnan Kafiyet, who, based on his experience at the National Security Council, had told me how Mr. Hadley had set the gold standard at the NSC, and he helped make our country function seamlessly at home and abroad. He is also a man, he described him definitely as a man whose work, he brought great dignity and respect to his work, and he was the epitome of confidence. And as many of you who know Dr. Ajami, it was very familiar to me to hear Mr. Hadley described as a very big brain, and one of our national treasures on foreign policy. So I would like to please join me in welcoming Stephen Hadley and our moderator, foreign policy and international affairs journalist Elise Lapin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Mike. And I would agree with that description of Stephen Hadley, certainly a treasure in many ways. Thank you to everyone for coming. We see so many friends in the audience, and what we're going to do is something a little bit different here tonight. Steve and I are going to kick out the conversation, but we're going to kind of open it up to you because there's so much great experience in the room, and you know we're going to keep it more of an informal discussion as opposed to a question and answer. I just want a few words about Dr. Ajami, and his wife is here tonight. And is that not you? Sorry, I thought she was here. Oh, I'm so sorry. She was sitting right here. I'm so sorry, but I just wanted to say, you know, I have friends that that he was their professor years ago, and I mean, we're not going to talk about like the nitty-gritty of the news out there today. We're going to talk about big issues in the Middle East and the policy challenges and opportunities, and those were the kind of existential questions that Dr. Ajami was looking at. And you know, there were so many students here tonight. You would be lucky if you have one professor that touched you the way he touched so many lives, including a lot of people in this room. So thank you so much, and sorry I bumbled who you were, because we never met. Anyway, we're going to kick it off again. We're going to talk a little bit, and then, you know, if you have a point or if you have a question and you want to join the discussion, feel free to signal me. Steve, let's kick it off by...
Can I say one thing about
sure.
Fouad before we do?
Yeah, please do.
The truth is we were all students of Fouad Ajami. And I remember very clearly in 2005, 2006, which were very dark days in terms of what was going on in Iraq. And when I needed some perspective, I would call him up and I would say, can you come by? We need to talk. And it was wonderful because he would step back, pull you out of the day-to-day, give you some more historical perspective. But the other thing is, while he was a realist, he had great confidence that in the end of the day, after all the travails, the Middle East would make it. And I remember at one point when things were going very badly in Iraq, and we were thinking about the surge and other things to try to turn it around, he said, you know, in the end of the day, they'll make decisions at the 13th hour rather than the 11th hour, but in the end of the day, the Iraqis will not let you down. And in terms of our experience with them, by the end of 2008, they hadn't. So I just think he was a wonderful resource for our country. And I had a professor like him when I was at Cornell, who's the reason I and a whole lot of other people got into this foreign policy game, both Republicans and Democrats. Sandy Berger, who was 8 years in the Clinton administration, I was 8 years in the Bush administration. We were both in Washington doing that work because of Walter Lefebvre at Cornell. And Fouad was one of those kinds of people. And there's a whole legacy of people that he helped train and inspire to help do the work of this country in foreign policy. And we miss him. We miss him. We need more of him. Anyway, thank you.
Big thinker. Let's talk about some of these bigger issues. You and I were talking about a recent report by Lee Hamilton and Governor Keane from U.S. Institute of Peace, where you're the chairman, about extremism in fragile states. You know, nearly 20 years have elapsed since 9/11, and you know, counterterrorism policy has largely succeeded in terms of preventing another attack. Or disrupting, degrading, dismantling these networks. Yet, you know, despite this success on the battlefield, extremist groups exploiting, you know, weak governance, political instability is thriving. And the threat posed by violent extremism and ideology has evolved. And, you know, jihadist fighters are still traveling more than ever. not just to the Middle East, but the Horn of Africa and the Near East. So let's talk a little bit about whether, this counterterrorism strategy of disruption versus the idea that is prevention the way to go, and how do we look at prevention of extremist ideology?
Well, one of the things we shouldn't do is lose sight of the contribution that the counterterrorism has made. So after 9/11, we got intelligence assessments from the CIA, and their assessment was that 9/11 was the first of a wave of mass casualty attacks, some of which would involve weapons of mass destruction. And people forget that within about 30 days, suddenly envelopes containing white powder showed up at the heads of news organizations up in Capitol Hill, contained anthrax, and killed people on Capitol Hill. And we didn't know where it came from. And it seemed like the prophecy was coming true. The prophecy did not come true. We hardened America at home, we took the fight to the bad guys abroad, and that prediction did not come true. And this is an enormous accomplishment for our country, Republicans and Democrats, Congress and the executive branch, but mostly the American people. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. But the truth is, our policy got too focused on the counterterrorism. The truth is that there are more nations now where al-Qaeda and other similar groups are active than there were in 2001. There are multiple more extremist fighters, terrorists today than there were after 2001. So we've kept the country safe, but the terrorist problem is increased and metastasized.
It's like whack-a-mole.
It is, and if you talk to military officers, they would be the first to say that we can't kill our way out of the problem of extremism. And it was, for me, crystallized 18 months ago. I was in Iraq, and I talked to a Sunni tribal chieftain, and he said, so you Americans, you've helped us win the Battle of Iraq 3 times. You helped us defeat Saddam, you helped us defeat al-Qaeda, now you helped us defeat ISIS. When are you going to win the peace? And that is the question. And the problem is, and this report focused on fragile states. What constitutes a fragile state? What really has become clear, and I think we've learned a lot in the last 17, 18 years, it's a problem of governance. It's governments that are not legitimate, that do not have the support of their people because they are corrupt, they are not responsive, and they're not delivering services, prosperity, and security to their people. And the problem of those fragile states is they become then targets for terrorists and extremist exploitation. They are the source of an overwhelming amount of poverty in the country. They are the source of refugee flows, which we see almost destabilize the politics in Europe. And they are opportunities for other states to dabble in and pursue their own geopolitical
Like
objectives
proxy wars.
inside these fragile states. Exactly right. So what is the strategy of prevention? The strategy of prevention says that what we need is to address the underlying problem that allows extremists to come in the door, and that is the problem of governance in fragile states. And the strategy basically is we need to partner with those leaders in fragile states who get it, who understand what the problem is, and have a more positive vision for their people. If you don't have local buy-in, if you don't have local leaders who are willing to lead in that direction, it will not work from the outside. So we have to be strategic. We have to focus on states where the fragility implicates our interests and where we have a partner. And then we need to work with them and support them to provide for their people the kind of governance that will win them over and give an alternative narrative to the narrative of the extremists. That's really what the report says. And it's going to be a long-term process. But in long-term processes, if you don't start today, it takes even longer.
Because, U.S. military interventions, whether it's Iraq or Libya, it just basically the extremists kept coming, and every time they were eliminated on the battlefield, they would either come back there or they would pop up somewhere else. And I'm wondering if there's a shared understanding in the United States that extremist ideology is, or violent extremism is political ideology, not necessarily, a kind of physical, technical thing that you have to root out.
I think there's an emerging consensus that the problem is one of governance. I think there's also a consensus that bad governance not only is not responsive to the people, but in some sense makes it worse. One of the things we discovered in talking to people is a number of folks said the number one thing that is the recruiting tool of the extremists is local security forces that abuse their own people. And if you interview people who have moved over to extremism, that's the number one thing. Well, that's something you can do something about. You can train local security forces.
Like in Afghanistan, for instance.
Exactly right. Something that you can do something about. We don't do that particularly well. One of the things we discovered in Iraq, we don't do police training particularly well. It's a real skill. And just giving to the military doesn't get that done. It's a different skill. But there are things that we can do ourselves. And one of the things we have to do then, particularly with those states that do not have enlightened leaders who are willing to do what they should do to address the problems of fragility and bad governance, is there may be reasons why we have to cooperate with such leaders for other interests, but we've got to do it in such a way that we don't make the problem of fragility worse. And that, I think, is a problem.
Well, I mean, looking back, I remember when, the whole idea of, the freedom agenda of the Bush administration, there was the idea that the U.S. kind of neglected for 60 years dealing with authoritarian regimes without thinking of democracy. But we've gone back to the idea that, democracy is not as important as security or stability, it seems.
Well, again, I think this administration has other priorities. I think even
the Obama administration, too.
I was going to say, even the Obama administration, I think, thought that the Bush administration went too far. And in some sense, with the Freedom Agenda, promised more than we delivered and failed to take account of other interests we have. I think, there's this old notion of, is it your values or its interests? And I've always thought that's a false choice, that it is very much in our interest to promote our values in the world, because a world based on those values is going to be more congenial to American safety, security, and prosperity. So I don't believe that. But there are trade-offs that have to be made, because we do have multiple considerations in our foreign policy. And the question is, can you get the balance right? Everybody says this is the dawn of, the return of the authoritarian, the second Star Wars movie, The Empire Strikes Back. Well, the authoritarians have struck back. But, look at what is going on in Sudan. Look at what is going on in Algeria. Look at what's going on in Venezuela. Look at what's going on in the Czech Republic right now, in Slovakia. It's very interesting. The desire of people for freedom and to manage their own affairs turns out to be a pretty stubborn impulse. And even in supposedly the era of the return of the authoritarians, there's some really interesting things going on. And I think we should be supporting more of them. I think in some sense, Iran would be a lot, and I think this will be controversial in this group, I think Iran would be a much different place if we had had a different policy in 2009.
How so? Supporting the protesters.
Yeah, I think we could have done it in a way that would have not, that would have created more space.
How do you do that?
The regime initially, I think, was intimidated, was uncertain, and I think if we had come out more stridently that no regime should use violence against their own people when they are innocently protesting their government, we could have helped clear some space and give them more in which to act, and we could have, I think, made the regime more reluctant to crack down. Who knows, second guessing. But there are opportunities that arise, and the question is, can we be smart about making clear we're on the side of those people that are demonstrating for their own freedom?
Okay, look back, let's play it out. Look back at the Arab Spring. I mean, obviously a country like Tunisia, was able to withstand, an overthrow a government, but country. And, Libya, we've seen, even though Gaddafi was overthrown, the kind of extremism and extremist ideology and violence that came. And, look at Syria, look at some of these other countries that, how do you strike that balance between, supporting these movements and supporting, democratic change, while at the same time the U.S. can't get involved everywhere. The U.S. can't be the policeman. You saw, whether it was the Obama administration or now the Trump administration, very reluctant to get involved in those type of conflicts. How do you strike that balance?
Well, and it's easy to say because I wasn't in the administration.
What would you have done? Let's say the Arab Spring happened on your watch.
I think one of the things that President Bush would have done is he would have seen that as an enormous opportunity to advance the freedom agenda. And I think we would have had a more of a focus and a more commitment of resources than we did. That doesn't mean it wouldn't necessarily have come out differently. But I think, one of the things we could have done is help provide security, because one of the things that corroded the optimism of the Arab Spring was the lack of security. People need to be secure. People need to eat. They want freedom, but they want freedom in part because they think that freedom brings security and prosperity. And if you don't give them security and you don't give them prosperity, freedom will take second place. And I think that's the question that people, and there are folks in this room who studied this and may want to offer some suggestions. But I think we should have seen it more, not as a crisis to be managed, but an opportunity to be exploited, to transform, in the words that Fouad would have used, to transform the Middle East. It was a golden opportunity, and I think we didn't make the most of it.
Because look at a country like Egypt. You had, Mubarak left. Everyone thought that Sisi was this kind of democratic change that you were looking for. And in the end, the Egyptian people chose security over that type of...
But that's because democracy began in people's mind to mean chaos. And chaos meant insecurity. And, again, if people have a choice between eating and security and chaos, they're going to take eating and security, even if it's under authoritarian, rather than chaos. That's what we learned from the Arab Spring. So you need to have a strategy that addresses the chaos, and I don't think we did.
So what's the strategy? How do you strengthen these societies so that if there is democratic change, it's managed well?
I think you have got to identify local partners who have the right vision, and then make it clear to those partners that if they are willing to take the tough steps that are required to realize that vision, they will have the United States behind them. And, the best example, one of the few examples, sadly, when, we have been able to work with a fragile state that was had the problems of narcotics and terrorism and instability and all the rest, was in Colombia. And the formula in Colombia was really to back President Uribe, who a lot of people have bad things to say about him, but he was willing to make very hard decisions to take on the terrorists and the narco-traffickers, and to try to do it through democratic means. And we basically told him, President Bush told him, if he's willing to take on the terrorists and make the hard decisions for his people, he will have our support. And I was with some of the people who were in the Western Hemisphere Directorate at the NSC last night at an event honoring one of them. And one of them said, you know what you told us after President, met with Uribe and said, if you go after the terrorists, I'll be on your side? I said, no, what did I say? And he said, you brought us into the office and you said, your job is to keep Uribe alive because he's the key to transformation in Colombia. And he was, and they did, and he did. And Colombia is one of the few success stories today.
All right, we're going to go on to some other topics in a minute, but I want to open it up to the floor.
Good.
We have a lot of experts in this room. I'm sure a lot of people who have thoughts about what we were discussing. I'm just going to open it up if there's anyone that... My friend? Please identify yourself and your affiliation.
We have mics that are coming your way.
Thank you. I'm Joel Rayburn, now with State Department, formerly Army.
Working with the envoy for ISIS in Syria. Thank you for coming.
I'm just here in a personal capacity.
That's fine.
This evening, and I'm only going to ask a question.
At this point, it's off the record until he finishes and sits down, okay?
Concerning Iraq, during the Bush administration, and the phenomenon, the reaction to, as you put it, failed or weak governance in fragile states. Iraq certainly qualifies under that definition. And of course, there was a vast terrorism problem in Iraq, insurgency problem in Iraq. But your prescription, Mr. Hadley, that it was finding partners, local security forces that you could use to try, and then in some kind of partnership, trying to strengthen the governance so that the government, really the state, is more legitimate, and then the steam would seep out of the grievances that, to the extent that grievances drove terrorism or insurgency. But to some extent,
It's a good formulation.
but to some extent, that's not all that drives terrorism and insurgency. There's state sponsorship. And in the Iraq campaign in particular, the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad sent in many thousands, was an offshore logistical base for al-Qaeda in Iraq and others. And of course the Iranian regime, which was doing the same
With the militias.
through the Shia militias. So since you were there having to formulate a response to those phenomena, it seems like the Iraq campaign, as someone who was in it in Baghdad, Slaughter, and other places, we understood the local approach, the clear, hold, build, for example, that we didn't always call it that. But what was being done? What was the thinking about the state sponsorship and really a proxy war that was being carried out from both sides?
It's a real problem, and I think one of the things we did not do, I don't think we were as disruptive of what Syria was doing as that we should have been. At one point, there was a proposal to be much more active in Syria, maybe even to try to change the regime. And the attitude of our military commanders was, we got our hands full in Iraq. Let's not go stirring up another neighboring country.
Given what you saw now, is that a mistake? Should you have gone there?
I think it wasn't a mistake necessarily then, but we may have had other opportunities. But I think we didn't do that one as well. On Iran, our assumption was that in the end of the day, the Iraqi Shia would be Iraqis first and Shia second. And that proved out. So when we did the surge, the interesting thing about the surge is when we actually had the right strategy and mobilized the Iraqis behind that surge and got a commitment from the Iraqis that they would participate in the surge and do it in a non-sectarian way, because what Maliki had been doing was Sadr City was a safe haven. Our troops couldn't go in Sadr City, and if we picked up Shia terrorists, we'd get a phone call and he'd ask us to let them go. And the notion is this surge is only going to work is if you're part of it, if you're contributing troops, and it's done in an even-handed way across the board. No sanctions and no sectarian agenda. And he agreed on that, and that was the execution of the surge. And even in spite of all the Syrians were doing and the Iranians were doing, it succeeded. And at the end of the day, as you know, in 2008, Maliki, who everyone thought had a Shia sectarian agenda, goes south and takes on the Shia militia in Basra and almost gets himself killed in the process. So it's one of the problems of fragile states that, you have extremists in the pot, you've got poverty in the pot, you've got people being displaced, and they attract outside intervention. And you've got to take on each of those problems. Zal Khalilzad, in terms of Afghanistan at this moment, is trying to get the outside powers aligned to support a peace effort so they will use their influence on their surrogates in country. It's very difficult. It is part of one of the things you have to do, but it's one of the reasons that makes these fragile states so difficult to handle.
But
It starts with governance.
But, okay,
The
so-
people will not rally against the terrorists if they don't have confidence in the government that will give them a prosperous
and to your
future.
point, I mean, he's dealing with the outside powers and the Taliban itself.
Correct.
But, you see all these reports every day about how Afghan security forces are beating up citizens. The corruption is, rampant. And the warlords are, more powerful than ever.
Well, one of the things, and we can have the discussion about Afghanistan, and I haven't been there for about a year or so, but one of the problems about the Middle East today is Washington has an embargo on any good news coming from the Middle East. They just do. And I'll give you an example. So there's a wonderful person named Chris Schroeder. Chris Schroeder is an entrepreneur
You
from...
stole my thunder on that. Anyway, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, it's okay.
You gave me an opening and I took it.
Go ahead.
Chris Schroeder is a wonderful entrepreneur and he's in touch with entrepreneurs in the Middle East. And there are a lot of them. He's written a wonderful book about it. But he sent me an email 4 or 5 months ago, and it said, another thing about the Middle East you won't read about in the mainstream media. There was, and I'm going to get this wrong, but, it's like Ronald Reagan, the facts will be wrong, but the spirit will be right. So I'm going to get this wrong. But he basically said, there was a 2-day convention, I think it was in Cairo, where 3,000 young entrepreneurs gathered and exchanged ideas for 2 days. And it was an extremely heartening and reassuring event. Of course, got no mention anywhere in any media in Washington. So, I know what you said about Afghanistan.
There's a lot of
all of
issues
those
there, too.
things go on. The question is, can you make progress over time? And I would say, what's interesting is that for all the difficulties you describe, and there are folks here who can speak to this more authoritatively than I, what surprised me in Afghanistan is, given Afghans' history and their allergy to outside forces, it's amazing that United States forces are still permitted and accepted in Afghanistan, not wholeheartedly, 17 years, 18 years after we first appeared. It is amazing that support for the Taliban among the Afghan population continues to go down. So you have to say that somewhere in there, for all the things you say, which are certainly true, the Afghan people and the Afghan government are doing something right.
No, there are a lot. There are a lot of gains, but the question, and maybe this is a conversation for another day, but the question is, does it deal with the Taliban, between the U.S. and the Taliban, that, doesn't deal with some of these issues? Does it Does it risk those gains? And I guess that's true for any country in the Middle East.
But if you're going to have peace in Afghanistan, it isn't just going to be a deal between the United States and Taliban. That deal has to be embedded in the intra-Afghan dialogue.
Well, it's supposed to be.
Because there are people who have grievances against their government that are more than just the Taliban.
Right.
They're the people who didn't take
Right.
up arms. If you have a peace arrangement with the Taliban that doesn't address the
Right.
grievances of those who didn't take up arms, that sets up incentives you don't want. So you've got to have it U.S. Taliban inside an inter-Afghan
that's the
dialogue,
goal, right? That's what
inside
they say.
a regional consensus, and then with an international community that's going to help encourage the kind of interconnectedness in that region that will produce prosperity. It's not, the point I'm making is this problem of fragile states is really hard. It's going to take time. It's probably a generational project. But you have to get on with it.
Well, let's pick up on your excellent idea of Chris Schroeder's book. It's called and for anybody that is interested, it's called Startup Rising: The Entrepreneurial Revolution Remaking the Middle East, and it talks about this kind of different reality taking shape around the region. And it started really in Israel, where you talk about a startup nation.
Right.
And there's so much technology, and there's so much innovation, and there are so many startups. And the idea that could this play a role in changing attitudes among Arabs and Israelis in the absence of any real traction on the Israeli-Palestinian front? You have this whole new ecosystem where women are creating businesses, It's looking,
Right.
technology is growing, and people are using it in a whole new way. It's dealing with the teachings of Islam. It's really kind of technology is really taking root in the region, and so do these platforms open up avenues for discussion and cooperation in the absence of any real political progress?
It's interesting because we had always thought that one of the virtues of an Israeli-Palestinian peace embedded in a broader reconciliation between Israel and their Arab neighbors would permit the kind of economic integration that would allow Israel to be an engine for prosperity for the whole region. That was the hope, that was the dream. And, we never could get that launched. One of the things that's interesting is I think a lot of the countries in the region, the Arab countries, see the potential for Israel and for economic ties and using the entrepreneurship of Israel to lift up the economic prosperity of the region. And the only people who seem not to get it right now are the Palestinians, which is one of the great tragedies. And their dilemma is, and it's very real, and you can talk to some folks. Salam Fayyad is a good articulator about this. The problem for the Palestinians is the more they cooperate with Israel on things economic, the more it looks like they're simply beautifying the occupation. And that was the problem that Fouad used to say, Salam Fayyad used to say, I can only go so far without a political prospect for some kind of peace, because otherwise, I become a traitor to my people. And that's the tragedy for the Palestinians. They're caught in that.
Well, so this is a controversial question, but if you look at what's happening with the Mideast Economic Plan, which I think largely, if you read the plan itself that Jared Kushner just introduced in Bahrain, if you read the plan itself, it does offer all of these, economic prosperity and future for the Palestinians. My feeling is, had they done it without having moved the embassy, without having cut aid to the Palestinians, it could have been used as a precursor to a political deal with showing, the promise of what could be. Is there any way that the Palestinians can say, let's go for the economic first, and if we build it, it will come, we'll be a more prosperous, we'll be a more developed people, and then we'll be, a more formidable negotiating partner for the Israelis?
It sounds very rational, and it may be what Kushner and people hope for, but other people can speak to it. Politically, for the Palestinians, it's a non-starter. It just doesn't work, and particularly after the moving of
Right.
the embassy and all the rest. They have their politics too. It's a great tragedy. And the other problem we found when we dealt with it, it's almost like God doesn't want an Israeli-Palestinian peace. Every time we thought we got something framed up, for a long time, it was every time we got something framed up for an initiative between the Israelis and Palestinians, Hezbollah or Hamas or somebody would do a terrorist attack. And rather than terrorist attacks forcing the parties to accelerate their efforts towards peace, it would, of course, everybody would step aside and say, well, I can't negotiate under threat of terror. We finally got Sharon, after the Gaza disengagement, to think about a much more ambitious notion of peace, and he has a stroke. So Olmert steps in. Olmert is going to do the same thing. He's prepared to negotiate it, but if not, he can't negotiate it. He'll do it unilaterally. Very ambitious plan, and he gets in trouble with criminal indictments, and nobody deals with him. He goes. And in this case, I think Kushner would have tried to roll out both the political and economic peace if we did not have this rerun of the Israeli election, which pushes it off to September. Is that when it's scheduled?
Well, it's scheduled.
And then, of course, we're into our own election cycle. And it just, there just never seems to be a time when the stars align, and that's where we are now.
What does Kushner need to do to get it back on track?
I don't think he gets it back on track.
You don't?
I just don't see it. The stars haven't aligned, and neither the Israeli community or the Palestinian community, for different reasons, are ready to do a peace. And, I still am, and others can comment on this, I still think that the days of sort of a sit-down, comprehensive negotiation of peace are over. That if you're going to get it, it's got to be a set of sequential interim steps that have both a political and an economic peace, or an economic and a political peace. And you got to build it in some sense from the ground up. And that's what I think we need to be doing.
Well, if you look at what's happening in Bahrain right now, I think what's really interesting is, the Israelis, there are no Israeli officials or Palestinian officials there, but there are Israeli businessmen, Israeli
Yep.
journalists in Bahrain, and they're, commingling with Arab leaders, and there's no criticism of Israel right now in Bahrain. There's no rhetoric. It's, largely congenial. So is this the new normal where, the Arabs and the Israelis are going to commingle and the Palestinians it's leaving the station without them?
Well, the big issue in the Middle East in terms of people's mindset
Is Iran?
is no longer the Israeli-Palestinian
Iran.
issue. There are other issues, and number one is terrorism, and number two is Iran. Well, in that area, our traditional Arab allies and Israel are aligned, and as we all know, there's a lot of cooperation under the table, and the Israelis would love to take that cooperation under the table and put it on the table, and that's still too much for the Arab states to do, but it is transformed the Middle East, and sadly, the Palestinians and their issue has been left behind. I will say, I used to go around to our Arab allies and argue for more money for the Palestinian cause, and Salam Fayyad, in my view, was prime minister in Palestinian areas and was really trying to create the institutions of a Palestinian state before a Palestinian state. Institutions that weren't corrupt, that were committed to fighting terrorism. He made enormous progress, and I would see him and I would say, so how are you doing getting your money from the Arab states? And he said, well, the Saudis gave me $60 million, and I had to go to the king and sort of thank him very much. $60 million is a month and a half's payroll back in those days of the Palestinians. So, the region never, I think, did for the Palestinians. They used them rhetorically for their own domestic political purposes, and they didn't really put the resources behind them, and particularly Salam Fayyad, and they missed a bet. They missed a real opportunity, sadly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hadley. One of the great pleasures of being a student of Professor Ajami was, going into his office, having office hours or being summoned to the Tabard Inn to have lunch with him. The conversation would start on Middle East politics, but then it would, evolve into literature. He was a great reader of novels, philosophy, pop culture. He knew his pop culture as well, but also he had this great understanding of the broader world beyond the Middle East and America's place in that world. And so in that spirit, I wanted to ask you a question about, the China challenge.
That's a great question.
This is probably the most significant, challenge, managing the China relationship today. And I just wanted to ask you, how are we doing?
I think the U.S.-China relationship is going to be the thing that is going to drive the future on almost every issue, and it's the most important thing. Second, what has astonished me, really, and I've been sort of at this business for a long time, is the transformation in elite opinion over the last 3 or 4 years in the United States. It's amazing. Now, a lot of it is driven by what Xi Jinping has done in terms of boxing out our industry, stealing our intellectual property, cracking down on his own people. I mean, it's a long list. And in some sense, I think he also decided that it was time for China to step forward and have a more public role in the world. And I think he got it wrong. I think it was a strategic mistake. because it awaked the sleeping dragon, and the sleeping dragon wasn't China, it was the United States. And so I think there's a big chunk of American elite opinion that thinks China is a global hegemon, an economic predator, a military threat, and an ideological rival. And this notion that if we engage China, they'll be part of the international system, they'll be a responsible stakeholder and a potential partner, which is what people thought we were doing for the last 40 years. People
I
just,
think you
they just
guys
say
were the
that's-
one. Bob Zellick was the one who.
Zellick was that one. People basically say that has failed, and it was destined to fail at the beginning because it didn't really understand China. We can have that discussion, but the point is, it's moved in a dramatic way. People are now awakened to the problem and the challenge China presents. In the way people do when they're surprised by something, we're probably overreacting. We don't yet have a strategy. Somebody in the administration said to me, we don't have a strategy yet, we have an attitude. And our attitude is push back on China everywhere. And that's where we are. And the areas where I think I'm most worried about a collision is in the technology areas. So it's clear that our relations with China are going to be more competitive. The risk is that they become only competitive. And if it's only competitive, it's going to push us toward confrontation and treating China as kind of an across-the-board adversary. And the problem, of course, is that if you're worried about terrorism, proliferation, global warming, pandemics, you name your global issue, you can't solve it if China and the United States are not cooperating together. And if we don't cooperate, neither of us are going to achieve our long-term objectives, whether it's the American dream or the China dream. So the problem is, can we be both strategic competitors, which we will be, and strategic cooperators at the same time? And that's very hard, and it requires nuance. And you know, Americans, we don't do nuance too well. You're either with us, you're against us, you're a friend, you're a foe. But that is the challenge. And a lot of it is going to come to head in these high technology areas. And I think the trick is to figure out whether we can bound the competition in ways that still permits an area of cooperation. How do you do that? I'll give you an example. So 5G. We're all, locked in a fight about Huawei and 5G technology. This is the next generation of the communication technology. And we're trying to convince countries not to buy Huawei equipment, particularly in their 5G. And it will fail because they have a technological and a price advantage, and it just won't work. So that's our first step. Second step is we're out of the game. We don't have a competitor for Huawei. And so one of the things you do is, but we do have allies and friends, and one of the things we should be doing is using our allies and friends in this issue. So there is Ericsson, there is Nokia and Samsung. Let's share technology with them and create an alternative so countries don't have to choose Huawei or nothing. And then the last thing I would say is, and there are technologies available, let's use our technology so we can solve the problem without going to war with China. And these are technologies that allow you to lay a 5G network on top of compromised hardware. So we don't have to worry that Huawei, if it lays the hardware, can go up into the 5G network and steal the data and corrupt it and do whatever they do. That's, again, a case where we should use our strength. So I say to people, we're all focused on countering China. I think we ought to be focusing on getting our own house in order, getting our politics to work, so that we're actually solving some of these social issues that have been around for 2 decades. We've known for 2 decades how to solve immigration, what to do about Social Security, what to do about education. We're not doing it. We don't have an economy that's producing sustainable, inclusive growth. Our people are losing confidence in our democratic principles. We know all that. Let's attend to those things. Let's get our own house in order. Let's get into the situation that if we're going to be strategic competitors with China, we can compete. Yeah. And we can win. If we do that, we will have a domestic platform that will allow us to deal with China, Russia, or whatever comes. But, we're not there yet. And that's where we really need to go. And my concern is that we're going to spend all our time focusing on China. We're going to make ourselves adversaries, and we're going to pay a high price for that in a lot of different ways. Anyway,
Wow.
that's a long answer to your very good question.
No, it's a great answer. Vineet.
He's going to now tell you that everything I just said was wrong.
Only some of it. Puneet Talwar. I just want to say quickly that I want you to know that the affection for Professor Ajami was bipartisan. I remember being blown away, while I wasn't one of his students, I remember being blown away by his writings when I was in graduate school. And same time that you were turning to him, I was also turning to him. You probably heard my voice on your voicemail machine, answering machine in New York many times. But he was wonderful. And I don't want to relitigate the past here, but there are a couple of quick things I do want to mention that you talked about.
You should.
Iran.
You should. Yeah.
So it was interesting, being there at the time. We were getting messages, and Dennis Ross has talked about this, from Green Movement folks saying, please don't give us the kiss of death.
Right.
At that moment. So we didn't go as far as some would have liked, even some inside would have liked. We went far enough that the Supreme Leader reinforced his view that we were all about regime change, and it actually ended up slowing a lot of things down. So that's just one point.
And you're right about that, and that's why how we did it was very important. That's why the formulation I used, you don't endorse the Green Movement, you don't talk about freedom and all the rest.
Yes.
You simply say regimes shouldn't beat up on their own people.
Yeah,
but this is a very important point, because it is very difficult, and you can corrupt and discredit the opposition if we don't handle it right.
Yeah,
very tough.
and the president, quoted Martin Luther King and so forth at that time, but that was enough to really tick off the other side. On the Arab Spring, the way you talked about it and the opportunities, I felt like I was back in the Situation Room listening to President Obama. He very much saw an opportunity there at that moment, and you probably experienced this at multiple times. I don't want to blame the entire U.S. government apparatus, but let's just say sometimes the agility to execute a decision isn't always what one would like it to be, particularly in situations like this where you have to turn quickly and change a paradigm that has existed for a long time within our own government.
The other thing that you're not saying, and I think you will agree with it, is one of the problems my friend Bob Gates talks a lot about this. In a way, the Cold War was a situation where we actually did use all instruments of national power, military and non-military, in a coordinated way to achieve a strategic outcome. But we have both Republican and Democratic administrations have let those civilian tools that you need to deal with the problem of fragile states attrit over time. Informational tools, economic tools, development tools. So when President Obama sort of says, let's try to turn this into an opportunity, where's my toolkit?
Where's your USIA?
The cupboard was bare. We've invested in our military, and we have the best military in the world. We have underinvested in our non-military instruments, and surprise, surprise, it shows.
Yeah, and as you know, they're the number one advocates of diplomacy. But,
exactly right.
So my question, though, because Elise is going to kill me in a second.
But it's important that you made these. It's important you made these points to balance it.
But a lot of what you're talking about, future-looking, is the need for pretty active engagement. The counterterrorism strategy you described, long-term engagement, even with China.
Yep.
That sort of requires the United States being on its front foot. But I just want to ask you, honestly, looking at the sort of the political dynamic in the U.S., and not specific to this administration, but let's assume this is not an aberration, that this is a beginning of a longer-term trend. How do you square that circle?
It's short answer. We, me, a lot of others, the elites, lost touch with the American people. We fell in love with globalization and Americans' global leadership and all the rest, and we lost the American people. And the people who were critical in electing Trump were people who felt victimized by globalization, threatened by immigration, abandoned by their politicians, and betrayed by the elites. And they said, enough already. I'm hurting here at home. Pay attention to that. And if we don't fix those grievances and address those grievances at home, Americans won't support the kind of engagement that we have traditionally had in the world, and I would say we need for our own interest to address these problems. So I think if you want, America playing its traditional role abroad and to help refurbish this international order that was our creation is now under stress, you've got to fix these political problems at home. You got to get our politics working. You got to get our economy producing sustainable, inclusive economic growth, and you got to show American people that our system still works.
It seems as
Sorry.
if you're saying that Americans don't have the kind of confidence
Right.
in American exceptionalism that they might have had before, and they don't feel like they can compete.
I think that's right. Does that sound right to you? I mean, we've got a lot of students back there. So stand up. Tell us. How do you view your country today and our role
Who's
in
going
the
to be
world?
the first?
Okay.
In America's role in the world? That's the question.
America's role in the
Should we
world?
be engaged in the world today?
I would say, certainly when it comes to things like TPP and the Paris Agreement, those are places where we really do need to be leading, because those are
Interesting.
really areas where the world can be united by America's leadership. I mean, obviously they don't have the harmful effects that invasions can have, but those are both areas where, certainly since the end of the Cold War, the world can come together to achieve basic goals. And so, yeah, I think in those areas, absolutely, we need to be leading.
Good for you.
Lisa and I used to work together, so this is a real throwback. You saw what happened with
Introduce
Khashoggi and... Oh, sorry. Ariel Bashi with CNN. You saw what happened with Khashoggi and how this administration handled that, and I'm just curious how you think the Bush administration would have handled a similar situation with a crown prince who murdered a U.S. resident in that situation.
It's very tough, and I don't know for sure. I think that I think two things. One, I think the rhetoric would have been dialed up, and the condemnation would have been much clearer about it. Secondly, I think we would have had our own. I hope we would have had our own independent sanctions effort that would not just have sort of Me Too'd, with my impression, Me Too'd what the Saudis decided they would do. And third, I hope we would have kind of thrown Saudi and the Crown Prince in the doghouse in a lot more sustained way. The thing I think we would not have done, though there would have been a lot of pressure to do it, was to call for the Saudis to change the succession and pull the Crown Prince out of the line and say to them, we're not going to deal with Saudi Arabia if the Crown Prince becomes king, so you might as well fix that problem now. That's very tough. And I was in the region in this period of time with some of our friends and allies, and basically they said, you can do everything you want to do to contain it up to that point. But at that point, you'll lose the Saudis, you'll lose the region, and you will encourage the Saudis to go elsewhere like the Chinese and the Russians, and they believed in the region that they had an option to go there. And that's really where the crunch point comes, because I think for the Saudis, one, if you talk to people who live there, there is reform going on. It is more open, there is entertainment, women are organizing businesses a lot in their
They're also
home
getting
using
arrested,
technology. Some of them are. They are driving, though they drive, I'm told, on weekends because traffic's terrible in Riyadh. So the Saudis, I think, don't have a plan B to the Crown Prince.
Well, let me
And
ask you
so
something.
I think it's very tough, and I hope we would have done more, but I think probably we would not have done enough to satisfy a lot of people, and I think the crunch point would have been that point. Do you really basically say, we're not going to deal with this guy? And if you want a relationship with us, take him out of succession. that's tough.
I have a quick follow on that, and then we're going to go to this woman right here. So MBS is chastened, but he's not. He hasn't been sidelined, certainly, as you
Nope.
said. And I think some of the things that the U.S. would have liked to see him do in that mini doghouse period, end the war in Yemen, stop arresting dissidents, end the feud with Qatar. He's not doing that, and now there seems to be this region that is kind of letting him, remake the region in a way. Or is this the new normal?
Don't know. There's a reason why he didn't do those things. We would have loved him to do those things, but I think his problem was he didn't want to look weak. And every one of those things you articulated would have been viewed in the region as weakness on his part.
Well, the U.S. also didn't, I suppose, because the U.S. didn't really give any sticks to make sure that he did give them something.
The thing they should do is resolve the Yemen issue.
Yep.
And that would go a long way. And there's an opportunity there. I don't think they've been as aggressive as they should have been exploiting it, but that's another matter. Can we get her some mic assistance here?
Oh, it's
There it is.
working.
There
Sorry.
you go.
Great.
There you go.
I'm Maysam. I'm a student of Dr. Ajami, and in the same vein as my fellow Ajamite, as we say,
Ajamite, I love that.
Afshin here asked, I think it would be great to hear your thoughts on a country that's also very important to Dr. Ajami, which is Syria. If you were advising the White House today, what would you say? Where do we go from here?
If Fouad had been running our Syria policy, we wouldn't be where we are today. And all the good options are in the rearview mirror. And it's interesting, and again, it's easy for me on the outside. These issues, the one thing I want to say is these issues are very hard, and it's not the Obama administration didn't struggle with them. They really did. And one of the things I said to people, and I really think it's very important, I said to people, I have a lot of disagreements with the Obama administration, but one thing I have no doubt about is that the people in that administration are working really hard to doing what they think is best for the country. And I think we've lost that presumption of good faith across the aisle and people outside of administrations versus those inside administration, and that's a very precious thing. So what's interesting was, I think the dilemma, and I had a conversation actually with Sandy Berger with President Obama, where we made our pitch for an more active policy in Syria. And we pitched him on four things. There was a really important thing, a less important thing, an okay thing, and a minor thing. And we convinced him on the minor thing, and we lost all the others.
What was the minor thing?
I don't remember, but it was really minor.
Must have been really minor.
So what's interesting is in that period of time, there were Republicans and Democrats who said the same thing. This is to set the dilemma. The longer Syria goes untended, the more people will die, the more it become radicalized, the more it'll destabilize the region through terrorism and refugee flows, and the more it'll open the door to al-Qaeda. And that's exactly what's happened. Now, that's a statement of the problems. The question is, what do you do about it? I'm not going to go through the history. We are where we are. The policy the administration is pursuing, as I understand it, is probably the best policy we can do under the circumstances and given the limited resources and given the history and given the limited resources that we're putting to it. And as I understand it, the policy basically is to try to hold that area east of the Euphrates where we have the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish forces there, to try to work out an arrangement that provides a safe zone, if you will, in the northern part of that so that the Turks' security interests are protected and they're not tempted to come in. And to convince the Russians, the Iranians, and the Syrian and Assad there is no military solution, and let it sit. And similarly, put a lot of pressure on the Iranians through sanctions so that they are increasingly find it difficult to sustain the costs of being in Syria, and then let the Israelis whack them from time to time, as the Israelis have been able to do, and basically stalemate it, and convince the Russians that it's not in their long-term interest to do this, and try to get a political settlement that over time will lead to Assad's departure, and over time, as a condition of that, the departure of all foreign troops, Iranian and Russians. Now, that's going to be a big reach, but that requires us to continue to stay there. I think it's as reasonable a policy as any. The problem is it's pretty fragile. It's not clear how long the president will support it. It's not, the American people don't particularly understand it. I don't think it has broad public support. And, you know, I think there are a lot of other things that make it vulnerable. But I don't see, you know, I don't have any better idea. And I hope it works. I hope we stay with it. I hope it works, because the lesson, if Assad succeeds in all this, the lesson we said to the world is, if you're willing to kill enough of your own people in a brutal fashion, the world will let you stay in power. And that's a terrible lesson. Very tough.
I can't let you go without asking you on Iran. Now, you know, the Trump administration and Republicans fault the Obama administration on, you know, for making a deal with Iran. But we know that, you know, when you were National Security Advisor and Secretary Rice was Secretary of State, you had started, you know, willing to.
We wanted to deal with Iran too.
Wanted to deal with Iran.
Absolutely.
Where are we headed? What do the Iranians want, do you think? Afshin, I'd love to, before we close, I know we're running a few minutes late. You know, let's just look forward to Iran. It's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of tension right now, but I do think that both sides, neither one wants a war. Is there an opportunity?
Do you want to answer that question?
Which part of the
not monolithic.
But I think the, you know, the message was received in terms of the near missile launch, but there was a mixed message as well, because they also learned that President Trump does not want to go to war as well. But I'm not copping out here, but I want Patrick Clausen to get in here because he has an article out that is particularly about the new sanctions that I think are worth noting for this group. So Patrick, handing the baton to you.
Patrick, you're on.
So the Trump sanctions on Monday were aimed at the Supreme Leader. And the Supreme Leader thinks that his role is the essence of the Islamic Revolution, and that he personally is the embodiment of the revolution. So the actions on Monday were well designed to say to the Supreme Leader that what we want is regime change.
You see it that way?
He will see it that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think it was intended that way?
I don't know. But I do think it was intended to put maximum pressure on Iran out of the conviction that the Supreme Leader will not agree to negotiations because he wants negotiations, but only because, as he said, that it would be like drinking poison.
Like in Iraq.
An interesting analogy, because that's the phrase that Khomeini used
Right.
when he said why he would
talk to Iraq.
Agreed to a ceasefire with Iraq. And Khomeini has been prepared at times to drink poison. So we might get negotiations going, and if we did, I think that Trump's objective would be to be able to say he got a better deal than Obama, and that it would not be that hard for him to do that, because Khamenei could agree to things that he has already said he would do, like limit Iran's missiles to 2,000 kilometers or less, and what he is in practice doing in Syria, which is not crossing the Israeli red lines, by not proceeding with the precision missile program in Syria, but instead doing it in Iraq and Lebanon. And the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran said a few months ago on television that the JCPOA is very hard to violate because it's so ambiguous. And so I think it'd be possible to agree to some specifications about what do these various provisions mean. So frankly, and I've discussed this with some Iranians who I think are reasonably close to the regime, it would be possible to put together a deal. Is that likely? No, because the two sides don't trust each other. And a military confrontation is much more likely than a deal because the two sides miscalculate and we get into military confrontation.
Well,
but we could have a deal.
It didn't get a lot of play, but there was one of Rouhani's advisors, I forgot his name, said something, if you want something more, if you want us to give you something more than the JCPOA, you have to give
Well,
it.
and that's also possible because the U.S. has said that it would allow trade in civilian goods, especially humanitarian goods. But on the other hand, we've set up procedures which are so cumbersome they don't work. So we could set up procedures which actually work at doing that which we said we would do, which is to allow civilian, especially humanitarian goods trade. That would allow Khamenei to say, I got a whole bunch of sanctions, even U.S. sanctions, lifted, and Trump to say, well, that's just what we had said we would do all along anyway. So a deal is possible,
Right.
but frankly, a confrontation is more likely.
So why is that? One,
They mistrust each other?
No, I have a different explanation. I'm going to take the microphone back for a moment. One, I think the two leaders don't want a confrontation. And I think that the problem is that there's an underlying dynamic that is going to push them in that direction. Because we are going to continue to ratchet in the sanctions and try to cut off the oil. And at some point, there's a red line there when it becomes intolerable for the Iranians. And similarly, they have decided now they're going to walk out of the nuclear deal. At some point, if they continue that, there's going to be a red line for Trump. So the risk is that this escalates to the point where we start crossing red lines and somebody shoots. I think, secondly, what they are doing and what Trump did, which was actually smart, if you do conventional retaliation, you go up the escalator ladder pretty quickly. But if you keep it asymmetrical, you can manage it longer. And the Iranians are good at asymmetrical responses. And Trump didn't strike them conventionally, but he did a cyber attack, so as the press says, and he did sanctions. We can decide whether sanctions were right. But he did something. He didn't show weakness. So I think that this could go on for a time and probably needs to go on to a time. But I think people are telling the administration that the only time, we're going to stop right now. I'll be done in 1 minute. The only time Iran changes policy is under enormous pressure, diplomatic, military, and economic. And they're trying to create that pressure so he will drink from the poison chalice. At some point, when the pressure builds enough, I would hope our European friends would come to the administration with this proposal. Look, you, Trump administration, freeze the sanctions and your activities where they are, and you, the Iranians, freeze your creep out of the nuclear deal where you are, and then come to talk and put everything on the table. That's how this ends in a positive way. And I think you're right. I think there's a deal to be had. So on that positive note, thank you very much. It's nice to be with you.
Thank you. I'm sorry.